On the previous video, I made the following comment.
Because the storm will likely get very big in size, and that could have tremendous impacts in terms of pushing water ashore all across the northern Gulf Coast.
And I don't think some of the viewers quite understood exactly what I meant by that in terms of storm surge flooding on parts of the Gulf Coast that may not even be directly affected by the storm, such as Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. And so I wanted to take this video. I'm not going to have the face cam on today. I'm just going to illustrate to you a little more in depth what I meant by that statement. So here we go. And first things first, I wanted to bring you the latest on Beryl as of 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time. It is currently a strong tropical storm. It has reemerged out over the Gulf of Mexico after making landfall on the Yucatan Peninsula. Pressure is down to 997 millibars, which hasn't changed since the 10 a.m. advisory, but that did drop a couple of times earlier this morning from 1001. So I do think the storm has potential to intensify further, and a lot of the reason why it's currently staying rather stagnant in the intensity is because it is currently over sea surface temperatures around 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is right on the border in terms of whether or not a hurricane strengthens or weakens. So it makes sense that it's just staying relatively steady. But as it moves to the northwest or west-northwest over the Gulf of Mexico over the next 1 to 2 days, it's going to be encountering water temperatures at the surface that are much closer to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And therefore, it will have the opportunity to spin up very, very quickly as it approaches the Texas coastline. And that could have tremendous impacts for the Texas Gulf Coast as well as northeast Mexico, especially in terms of storm surge. We will revisit the threat of storm surge in just a moment, but I wanted to emphasize another reason the storm is staying relatively stagnant and is relatively weak at the moment. The interaction with the Yucatan Peninsula did some serious damage to Beryl in terms of its intensity and its structure. And so right now you see it is reemerging out over the Gulf of Mexico as just this messy, disorganized storm, and it has completely lost the classic hurricane structure that it had a few days ago when it was traveling through the Caribbean Sea. It is currently putting any energy it can derive from the marginally warm waters in which it is sitting over to rebuild that structure of the hurricane. And once it develops that, it can then focus on increasing the maximum sustained winds of the cyclone. Now let's revisit the topic of storm surge, as that will be a huge concern as the storm approaches the Texas coastline here in a couple of days. And so you've got Tropical Storm Beryl out here in the Gulf of Mexico, just off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, and you can kind of think of it as just a giant paddle wheel spinning around and churning up the waters of the Gulf. And over the next couple of days, the circulation of Beryl will be taking advantage of those warmer sea surface temperatures over the northern Gulf of Mexico that I mentioned earlier to do two things. Both increase its maximum sustained winds. We're probably looking at about a category 2 or 3 by the time we're all said and done with it, and it does make landfall in Texas. And it probably will outperform the National Hurricane Center's forecast just a little bit. And it will also be increasing its wind field size. And that means a larger paddle wheel, which can churn up more water. And we already have evidence for this increase in the size of the storm. Just look at the National Hurricane Center's last 3 forecast advisories. You look at this first one, you have the tropical storm force wind field, the 34 knot wind field, 40 nautical miles, 40 nautical miles, and then 70 nautical miles. And then you see 90 nautical miles in the northeast quadrant. That was at 10 p.m. last night. And then you look at 4 a.m. You have the same thing, 40, 40, and 70 in the southeast, southwest, and northwest quadrants. But then you see the northeast quadrant come up to 100 nautical miles. And then you see the same thing happen where you have 110 now in the 10 a.m. advisory, with the others staying constant. So you see this gradual increase in the size, at least in the northeast quadrant of the tropical storm force wind field. And it looks like that trend will probably continue over the next couple of days, where you will see this storm expand in size. And that gives us serious concerns in terms of the amount of water it can push ashore along the Texas Gulf Coast and elsewhere in the Gulf of Mexico. Now let's take a look at Corpus Christi, Texas, for example. Beryl will approach tomorrow and will pass just to your east, it looks like, on Monday. And by that time, it will probably be a major hurricane after it spends that much time over the warm waters of the Gulf. And it will also be significantly bigger than it is now, and will have that much bigger paddle wheel. And the concern for Corpus Christi and the surrounding area is all of that water getting pushed in from the storm circulation and then funneled into that concave coastline, resulting in a higher storm surge than what you would normally otherwise have. And that's going to be a huge concern in places like Port Aransas. Not to mention, you've got all these other little bays along the Texas coast where you can have water funneled in such a way. And that goes all the way up to places like Galveston, the Houston metro area. And it also extends to other areas of the Gulf Coast. If this storm does become massive in size and also very strong intensity-wise, you could see water being pushed ashore in areas that otherwise aren't impacted by the storm, but you have all that water getting churned up in the Gulf. And even places like Dauphin Island, places along the coast of Louisiana, could see overwash in the coastal areas because of all that water just getting churned up by the storm's massive circulation. Another big concern is rip currents. Anytime you have the waters getting churned up like this due to a tropical system or even just strong winds in general, you're going to have rip currents, and that can have impacts far from the storm. I'm talking about several hundred miles all the way over to the Florida Gulf Coast. You could have rip currents and people getting caught in those. So really exercise caution if you're going to the beach anywhere along the Gulf Coast. And the National Hurricane Center has put out information about these threats. We're talking about 5 feet of storm surge in the forecast from the Boulevard Peninsula in Texas all the way down to the U.S.-Mexico border. And that's a little bit of an underestimate, in my opinion, given the potential you have for this storm, and because of all of the factors I just mentioned. And you also have a tropical storm warning in effect from Baffin Bay all the way down to the Rio Grande Valley, and a hurricane watch in effect from San Luis Pass all the way down to the Rio Grande Valley. And I think that hurricane watch will likely be upgraded to a hurricane warning within the next several hours. And I think we will see an extension of hurricane and tropical storm warnings farther east through Texas and Louisiana over the next day or two, due to the storm's expected increase both in size, intensity, and possibly ever so slightly eastward shift in the track as it merges with that mid-latitude cyclone in a few days. So just final thoughts, takeaways on the storm. It will stay relatively stagnant over the next few hours as it gets its act together over the Gulf of Mexico. But once it does, it will undergo a period or perhaps multiple periods of rapid intensification as it approaches the Texas coastline. And if you live in Texas or you live in coastal northeast Mexico or even Louisiana, do not take your eye off the storm. Follow it. Continue to monitor for updates. I will be posting updates on the James's Weather Forecasts Facebook page, which you can find the link for in the description down below this video. And if you're going to the beach anywhere along the Gulf Coast, be very careful if you go in the water. You'll likely have rip currents. Even in places that are very, very, very far away from the storm, you will still have impacts from it, as well as perhaps minor coastal flooding very, very far from the storm itself. And communities in coastal Texas, I'm talking about Port Aransas, Galveston even, any of those bays I pointed out earlier, any of those areas that water can get channeled in, be ready for a serious rise in the water level over the next couple of days, and have your preparations done. If you decide to make preparations or evacuate or whatever, make sure you get those done by tomorrow evening, because after that it will likely be too late and the storm will be coming ashore. Lastly, and I think this is the most important point to take home, do not wait until Sunday evening to see if Beryl really does intensify to start making preparations. You will most likely regret that decision. Just because it's a tropical storm now does not mean it will be at landfall, and in fact it very likely will not be. It will likely be much stronger. Hurricane Harvey back in 2017, another storm that reemerged off of the Yucatan Peninsula, and it was weaker than Beryl is now when it reemerged. and it spun up into a category 4 over the matter of a couple of days. So there is no reason why this storm couldn't do the same. It has all of that convective energy, all of that latent heat available to it that fuels these things. And this really is not something to let your guard down. I'm not saying it's going to become a bad storm like Harvey, but it very well could be.